I'll move on to the keynote presentation, really. And this is several months of work, pulling together different sources, analyzing quite a lot of data from the International Energy Agency. And I'm very pleased to invite Simon Minett. He's the Managing Director of Challoch Energy, and he will be presenting CWC's first global report on the cogeneration market globally. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hans. Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Good evening. Do you want me to share my screen, Hans?
Yes, please.
I'm having a few technical issues myself now. There we go. Okay, so as Hans has said, we were asked to look at the global CHP market, give an overview. This is a snapshot survey, effectively, so a moment in time. So we've looked at the whole planet as much as you can on these things. And I'm struggling with my, how do I move forward, Hans? Here we go. Okay, so the presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology and sources very briefly, give an overview of the situation worldwide, and then look at the regional markets, so Europe, North America, Asia, South America, Africa, and Australasia. And then I'm going to pick one country in each of those markets, the sort of one with the most dominant share of cogeneration to present. This is still quite high level, and you'll get more in depth for some of these markets in the later presentations. And then I'm going to finish a little with a little bit of thought about the current and future trends in the CHP market. So the methodology, it was desk research. We did a extensive data collection exercise and compared and then analyzed the data from different sources. Not surprisingly, those sources are not always compatible with each other. So there's a normalization process to be done. I think there's still quite a lot of work to do on that area, to be perfectly honest. Where there was conflict, we prioritized the IEA data for consistency, and some of the other sources covered different periods. Some of the sources included all the electrical generation from a power plant if it had a little bit of a heat offtake. Others separate out the cogeneration element of a power plant. And that is, at least in Europe, it's been an on-running debate for about 40 years. And in some markets, it's had the same sort of time, and in other markets, it's yet to really get going. The analysis looked at the period between 2009 and 2019. That's sort of the last full year of data that is consistent across the world, and clearly that's 3 years ago now. And you find with statistics it's always a couple of years or a year or so out of date anyway. We looked at the fuel mix, we looked at CHP electricity, we looked at CHP heat, and we looked at the share of electricity generation in the market from CHP plants. And I think the report itself will be available from CWC. Okay, if we look at the world as a whole, around about 4,000 terawatt hours of CHP electricity is produced by CHP plants across all the markets. Of that, around about 50% or so it comes from one market, which is China. and the total generation, the mix between cogen and non-cogeneration sources, cogen fulfills about 16% or so of the total market. That's the green dots that float across the top of the graph, and you can see it's wobbled around a bit over the last 10 years, but it's broadly consistent, around just over 16% of the system. What you can see is a general increase in both heat supply and electricity supply from cogeneration plants, but clearly that's setting a backdrop of increasing energy demand across the planet. So the share has gone down a little bit, but the amount of megawatt hours or terawatt hours produced by cogeneration plants has steadily grown. Okay, then turning to the fuel mix for the worldwide, you can see that the fuel mix is dominated by coal and coal products. And you'll see later when we get to China, when I present China, and China's 50% of the total, almost all cogeneration plants in China are coal. So you can sort of see coal from China and India dominate that market anyway. The next biggest share then comes from natural gas. That's typically a sort of European, North American a process, as well as many other markets, of course. And then there's smaller shares for renewable fuels, which we have seen grow dramatically over the last decade, but from a very low base. And then a whole bunch of other fuels, including nuclear, geothermal, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of future trends in fuels, we can expect to see pressure on both coal and natural gas across the planet, especially in meeting climate requirements. We see a trend, at least from a European perspective, of electrification of society, which means that more electricity is used instead of heating fuels, and that will probably change the proportions of cogeneration within the mix. And then the big mega trend in fuel is the role of hydrogen, either from reformed from fossil fuels and then carbon sequestered, so what's called in the jargon blue hydrogen, or from renewable sources, so green hydrogen, or from nuclear sources, going into the fuel system. And many of the technology companies have product now which is either hydrogen ready or very close to being hydrogen ready. So we see that as a major trend in the next decade, that hydrogen will be increasingly important in the mix. Okay, now turning to the continental markets. So to start with Europe, it's got about 700 terawatt hours of CHP electricity produced. We've seen over time a modest decrease in the share of cogen in the electricity mix, and not much growth in that market, to be perfectly honest. It's a mature market, and Europe as a whole is focusing on a lot of renewables and electrification. So we can see some pressure on cogen there, as it fights for its role within that process. It has a decent role to play, but it's an active policy debate, I think, is a good way of putting it. CHP represents about 20% of European electricity. This is based on the IEA statistics. And I use this just as an illustration of the difference between different statistical sources. If you take the European statistics, so from Eurostat, which is a slightly different methodology, then the amount of CHP electricity is a bit less. It's around about 12 or 13% versus 20%. And that's because the methodology for defining what is a cogen, so combined heat and power operation, versus what is separate production at other times. So you can see there is some discrepancy between the statistical sources. Main fuels in Europe for CHP, it's about 50% natural gas, and then we see quite a lot of renewables in that system, lots of biofuels, waste, biomass, that makes up 20% or so. And then a broad spread of others. Coal still has a large share, mostly in the eastern part of the continent, and that the coal element has been declining as it's been replaced by biomass and natural gas. And you can see in this, there's no role at the moment for hydrogen in this. It's not even on the graph. But if we present this in 5 years' time, I would expect to see at least a slither of the fuel mix being hydrogen, maybe even larger. Some additional details on Europe, and I don't do this for every country. I did this one for Europe. You can see that the CHP installed capacity is about 130 gigawatts, dominated by Germany. And Germany's the largest country as well in Europe. So 50 gigawatts or so in Germany, and around about that's about half of the total market. The market's dominated by combined cycles, gas turbines with heat recovery, and steam turbines, and they're the large the large capacity plants. And then there's a vast number of smaller plants based on gas engines, micro turbines, fuel cells, and things like that. Okay. This is a whistle to stop tour around the world. So North America next, 330 odd terawatt hours of electricity produced, so about half the size of the European market. A slight decline in the total share of electricity over the 10 years, from around about 7% down to about 6.8%. Not much change there, and no real substantial change in the actual output of CHP electricity or output of CHP heat. The heat moves around, depends on the time, the year, I guess, but the electricity is relatively stable. North America fuel mix is dominated by natural gas, more than 75%, so 3/4 of the fuel mix is natural gas, and then sort of equal shares, give or take, of biofuels and coal, and then small parts for other fuels. Largest market in North America, which is hardly a surprise, is the United States. That makes up about 90% of the total of North America, and it reflects very similar proportions, both in terms of the fuel mixes and the share of electricity. And you can see again the market has been fairly flat over the last decade. Not much change one way or the other. Moving slightly south into Central and South America, it's a much smaller market. It's only 87 terawatt hours, so less than a third of North America and 10% of Europe, plus minus. But this one has been growing. You can see there's been substantial growth in the decade, with cogen electricity going from about 4% up to about just over 7%, and almost a doubling of the total generation. So this is a strong market coming from a relatively small base. Main fuels are biofuels. 70% of the fuels come from biomass, biogas, and waste. Much smaller proportion from natural gas, and a smaller proportion again from coal, and then even smaller from other products. the largest market in South, Central, and South America is Brazil. Brazil makes up 90% of total CHP capacity in this region. So very similar to North America in that you've got one country dominating the picture. So 80 terawatt hours comes from cogen plants in Brazil. And again, the fuel mix, et cetera, reflects the region as a whole. 70% of the fuel going into cogen plants is biofuels. A larger proportion of the fuel is natural gas in Brazil, and that's in and around the Sao Paulo area. Turning now to Asia. Asia is by far the largest market. It makes up 55% of the total CHP market worldwide. It's nearly 3,000 terawatt hours out of the 4,000 or so terawatt hours globally. It's seen steady growth in terms of heat output. It's seen a little bit of growth in terms of total electricity output. And it's seen a slight decline in the share of cogen electricity in the system from around about 22.5% down to 20% over that period. The fuel mix in Asia is 75% from coal and 25% from natural gas and tiny little bits from other places. So it's dominated by those two fuels. Leading countries for cogen: China, Japan, and India. And we can see that China is a very significant proportion of that total. 68% of all co-generated electricity comes from China, and almost all of that electricity, that cogeneration is fueled by coal. But we do see a growing market there for natural gas, and we would expect the coal share to decrease over time. You can see there's been a decline in the share of co-generated electricity in the electricity mix from around about 35% in 2009 down to 25% or 27% in 2019. Next, turning to Africa. Africa is about the same size of market as no, it's not. It's a tiny market. Sorry, I'm mixing my terawatt hours and my gigawatt hours. So it's a tiny market. Mostly in places like Egypt, almost no share in many countries. But we also have to say that statistics are poor in this region as well. You can see a steady growth in CHP electricity and its share, but it's still below 1%. So it's still a tiny amount of the total share in Europe, in the global, in the fuel mix and the electricity mix. Finally, on the countries, turning to Australia. Australia is the biggest market in the sort of Australasian area, being again sort of 90% of the total. We can see it's a small market, 16 terawatt hours, a growth in the share of CHP electricity in the total Australian mix, but it makes up about 6% now, and a growth in CHP electricity output. There were no statistics as far as we could find in Australia for the share of heat, so that's not included in the graph. Most of the fuel used in cogen plants is natural gas, with smaller amounts of coal and biofuels at effectively 12% each. this is a market where hydrogen could come in quite quickly. I would have thought there's a lot of hydrogen production in the western part of Australia, either slated or in production, but the hydrogen at the moment is being shipped to Japan. So it's possible that some of the fuel could move to hydrogen in the next few years. Okay, I think this is my my last slide. Just some trends, and there's a lot of words on this slide, I'm afraid, and I'm not going to go through read it. I think the current situation is sort of dominated by Asia with 55%, and that's then dominated by China with 68% of that 55%. So concentration in one market, but that's clearly a very large market, of course. The European and North American markets have a developed CHP market, so a mature CHP market, which shows not much growth and no real shrinkage either. It's fairly stable. Technology-wise, dominated by gas and steam turbines, or gas turbines and steam turbines, and that's partly because of size, of course, and not sheer numbers of installations. And as we've seen in the presentation, natural gas and coal dominate, but we see a strong push for biofuels coming through that process. And as I've talked about a couple of times, maybe hydrogen as well in the future. Main end users, industry is very significant. So the continuous process industries, chemicals, pulp, paper, food and drink, and then in some markets, commercial residential facilities, so hospitals and universities, and then in many markets, China included, district heating is quite a important end use for the heat from cogeneration plants. If we then look at the forecasting, and this is a snapshot survey that really looked backwards rather than forwards, but just some general thoughts on the future. We see significant growth coming in India and China, and growth in South America, though we see significant challenges to cogen in the more mature markets, is that other technologies are brought in and pushed by policy. We see a transition out of coal-based generation. How fast that will be is a good question. It's certainly was happening very fast in Europe, and has called a little bit of a stutter to stop because of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and the impacts on the gas market. But yeah, I think generally across the world we'll see high pressure on coal being phased out, and that will be replaced by other fuels. And as I've said a few times, hydrogen, we would expect hydrogen in the next decade to become increasingly important in that process, not just as a clean fuel, but also because it gets generated from balancing out the vast amounts of renewables on the electricity system. Hans, I think for now that is me done. So thank you very much, and thank you for listening. And I can participate in the panel later and answer any questions on this.
Thank you, Simon. That was very comprehensive.